gives me great pleasure to welcome from afar, from North America. We have two very distinguished speakers, especially Professor Tian from Harvard, whom I've never met, and it's a delight to meet you, and Professor Richter from Colorado. So I hope the time zones are okay. It must still be, is it still morning or odd times of the day? You get this sort of strange displacement. And sitting actually next to me, who's come all the way from London, is Chris Foster, Dr. Chris Foster, who's I do know from past times, but it is very nice to welcome you. So our procedure today, I think, will be to allow our three speakers to give brief presentations, 10 minutes or so, on their take on this question, on our sort of question of authenticity, sincerity, especially in literature, but also manuscript culture, which is literature, I suppose. And after that, I think we'll ask them to make any observations and criticisms, comments, and praise for each other. So we've decided to go in chronological order, which means that Chris will start off because you're sort of Han, pre-Han type of period. And so,
great.
Take
yes,
it away.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. And what's more, to do so in person. As you said, it's very exciting. I also wanted to start by specifically thanking Dr. Xiaojing Miao. She's the Stanley Ho Junior Research Fellow at Edgar College here at Oxford, and she was really the motivator and the organizer behind this event. So it's a special thank you to you. I'm going to start my PowerPoint here. And just want to begin with a very brief initial, there we go, that should be the first slide, point that authenticity, and for me in the context of this discussion, that's authenticity in literature and in textual production, it's not an ontological status that is granted to a text. Rather, it's more of a judgment that we make about the nature of relationships between texts, authors, audiences, the authorities that govern the circulation of these texts, and the worlds in which they exist, right? And there's a lot of different criteria that we can use to make this evaluation. So what this means is that instead of treating authenticity in the singular, we need to allow that there are a multiplicity of authenticities in the plural, right? So in my own work, when I think about authenticity in texts, I tend to wonder foremost if the material that is in front of me, does it stem from the hand of its purported author, right? Or at least from the time and place that we think it was first composed. So this is a question of origins, right? It's a concern with the autograph. The reconstructed text of textual criticism has been developed in biblical studies. Those similar principles do underlie a lot of bianweishui in the Chinese tradition as well. But there are other criteria that we can use to make this judgment. We could ask if a text tells the truth, right, with a capital T. We can ask, does the text give make a certain promise for enlightenment or salvation? And does it deliver on that promise to believers? Does it encapsulate a certain aesthetic, irrespective of whomever the author may have been? Right? So now we have sincerity too, right? And this is another concept that we could subject to a similar exercise. For the sake of brevity, let me just say that I imagine sincerity as one such criterion for judging authenticity, which in literature concerns a sort of communion between author and audience that's mediated via text. So to put in strongest terms, sincerity reveals an author's true, unique self, right? But in a weaker sense, it describes instead an emotional bond or in a connection of internal states. Okay, but really today, I'm not that interested in definitions. Instead, I want to ask a historical question. So how did inauthenticity first become problematized for Chinese literature? When is textual insincerity an anxiety that is felt by Chinese audiences? And what led to this? Our earliest discussions on ritual and music and preach and sources largely presume sincerity in song and poetry. So the Shangshu, for instance, describes how 饰演之, right, how the odes give voice to intentions. And there is a bamboo strip manuscript. It dates to the Warring States period. It's called the Xingzi Mingchu. It offers this wonderful description of how song and dance are natural outward extensions of internal emotional states. It's on the slide here. So one is happy and then delights, one delights and then is stirred, one is stirred and then sings out, one sings and then shakes about, one shakes and then dancings. Dancing is the consummation of happiness. Right? And the manuscript also emphasizes that this dynamic works in reverse as well. So song and dance draw out feelings in their audiences. And again, on the slide here, so as for sounds, when issued forth from emotions, they are genuine. As such, when they enter into and draw out the minds of others, their impact is profound. Hearing songs, one is pleased and thus stirred. Yet here already we begin to see that complications arise to this rather simple picture, right? The manuscript qualifies that it is because sounds derive from emotion that they are xin, genuine, and thus potent. By implication, this admits the possibility that sounds can be divorced from emotion. And indeed, the manuscript goes on to decry way, artifice, as an obstacle in moral education. Okay, so artifice, right? It features prominently in Warring States philosophical debates over human nature, the relationship between humanity and heaven, how to conduct rituals and assume varied roles in societies, and our capacity for transgressive creation, that is zuo, right? So we think of Confucius's aspiration to shu'er gu zuo. But with the Xingzi Mingchu and other Warring States works, insincerity is not yet explicitly problematized in literary production. For this to occur, I believe a few additional developments needed to take place. And this includes, for instance, in the philosophy of language. At around this time, concerns appear over the possible discord between names and reality, that what we call things may not always match what they are. A ruler in name may not act like a ruler, a father, and so forth. There is, moreover, a conceptual separation of language or words from their meaning. Take, for instance, Zhuangzi's celebrated fish trap analogy, which I have on the screen. So when a fish is taken out of the trap and eaten, we no longer need to worry about the trap. And so too with words. Once the meaning is grasped, we can forget words, right? There's another later example that I really enjoy. It's in the VIII, and this is where Yang Xiong is critiqued for creating, that is, zuo, a text. And he responds cleverly that it is merely the writing he creates, while truth is what he transmits. So with this conceptual separation of language and meaning, an alternative understanding appears in the Han that compares textual composition to crafts production. We have in the VIII, for example, comparisons about how Fu rhapsodies are like the making of fine robes. On the slide here, there is a Lunheng, a depiction of scribes as technicians of the written word that manipulate phrases, which are the raw materials of text, as a carpenter fashions wood or a digger dirt. And in concert with these intellectual developments, changes also took place in the manuscript culture of early China. So while the purview of textual production was largely confined to royal courts during the Shang and Western Zhou, by the Warring States period, a broader segment of society interacted with text and participated in textual composition. Utilitarian uses of writing, moreover, came to be relied upon to support increasingly larger bureaucracies and then empires. And what this did was empower a hereditary scribal class through their literacy. Note that this also made scribes a target, derided by those outside scribal families aspiring to enter officialdom, especially during the late Western Han and early Eastern Han, as we see here with Wang Chong's comments. Complex paratextual framing becomes more frequent in Warring States works, situating anecdotes and poetic exposition as taking place in particular historical moments and involving sages, rulers, and other esteemed individuals. This is then followed by more explicit claims of authorship and self-referential statements within works, especially during the Han Dynasty, So here I'm thinking of the 一家之言, Shiji, or 柳氏之书, the Huainanzi. And with the wider circulation of texts, a greater distancing of authors and their audiences occurs. And there was an expectation, well, maybe if not an expectation, at least a desire that individuals can be known through and judged by their compositions, right? And they stood to benefit from this, if not through a type of literary immortality, but through concretely being noticed, for instance, by the court for their poetry and given positions, as was the case with Sun Xiang and Yao Qiao. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here because my time is short. Admittedly, this has been a very overly general survey, but hopefully it can serve as a prelude of sorts to our discussion, to touch upon sort of the intellectual and social conditions that were necessary for literary inauthenticity and insincerity to become an anxiety for early Chinese audiences. In my view, it is during the Han that we first see these conditions come together. And so here I just wanted to give one example from the Han. It's from the autobiographical chapter of the Lunhang, a chapter that is something we could consider actually a rare and very early piece of literary criticism. And so here Wang is replying to a critique about copying past models. And he says, if giving one's looks a makeover, if you force it to fit a certain type, then it makes that appearance lose its own shape, makes one's appearance lose their own shape, right? And polishing up one's words, similarly, if you strive to resemble others, that is past models, this makes the text lose its emotion. So thank you so much.
Well, that's a rich start to things. Let's move forward in time to Professor Antje Richter, who's coming to us all the way from Boulder, but seem to be coming through loud and clear. And you've also got something to share on the screen with us.
Thank you. And I would like to start particularly thanking Chris and Xiaojing for inviting me to this conversation. I really appreciate this opportunity to reconnect with the problem of sincerity and authenticity that I've been dealing with for many years, actually. We are all aware that the sincerity and authenticity can have many meanings and can apply to a broad range of issues further. And to make matters even more complicated, they overlap with other equally important words and concepts. In post-16th century English, for example, there is truth and genuineness. In early medieval China, there are ziran, naturalness or spontaneity, and qing, variously translated as actual inner condition, disposition, affectation, or truth. This word has already come up in Chris's presentation. In the different literary traditions, whether Chinese or European, these concepts have accumulated great amounts of culturally specific philosophical and ideological baggage. At the end of the last century, not long after Lionel Trilling's 1972 book, sincerity and authenticity went out of fashion for a while, only to return in this day and age, having gained new currency in discussions of truth of information and originality of artistic production. From fake news to NFTs, AI-created literary and visual content, and the development of brain-computer surfaces and their promise to bypass language altogether. As I said in my own research, I have grappled with the concepts of sincerity and authenticity, and I would like to share my screen with you to show you some of that. So in an article on Wang Xiju's notes, I have asked, for example, how the formulaic nature of these texts affects their power to convey authentic personal sentiments. And if we even can regard Wang's notes as authentic personal letters at all, or just showpieces that craftily fake intimate personal relations and concerns, or to perform a certain fashionable style of calligraphy. In a study of correspondence, sincerity and authenticity are, of course, discussed all over the place because etiquette plays such an important role in letter writing culture. In a book published 2 years later, I took a broader and more comparative view of these questions, but I again argued that even highly formulaic letters written at the time must be seen as fusing the demands of both normativity and authenticity. To rephrase, following the inspiring work of Michael Pewitt and colleagues in their 2008 book, Ritual and Its Consequences, epistolary communication represents a continuous interplay between ritual and sincerity, which, and I quote from the book, offer alternative modes of framing social thought, action, and interaction. Unquote. This interaction between alternative modes also emerges in another area of my research, in early and medieval autobiographical writings, which to a certain degree call for the performance of sincerity. In a forthcoming publication, I show that different genres of self-writing, preface, memorial to the throne, or Buddhist confession offer very different mixes of obeying the demands of ritual and convention on the one hand, and apparently authentic self-expression on the other. Rather than looking at a literary or calligraphic text, I would like to focus on Wenxin Jiaolong today and ask where Liu Xie brings up issues of sincerity and authenticity and what he has to say about their rhetorical functions. There are three main contexts in which the topic appears. In the first, so-called pivot chapters with reference to canonical ideas about poetry, in genre chapters, particularly in those that discuss performative types of texts, and in several of the concept chapters elaborating on the connection between the writer's specific situation and the works they create. Let's take a brief look at these different contexts. That sincerity and authenticity are considered in the pivot centers is only to be expected if we recall the basic canonical ideas about poetry that are expressed in the Book of Documents or the Book of Odes. Poetry springs from the interior of the poet's mind. The words I've highlighted here are 知, 心, 情, and 中, manifesting in apparently unadulterated form. Liu Xie builds on this implicit assumption of sincerity and authenticity in his first chapter, when he insists that Wen arises naturally, spontaneously. Note how he asserts the nature-culture continuum by calling even the beauty of clouds sculpted. In chapter 3, the first quality of writing in the style of the canon is that it is profoundly anchored in one's actual inner condition, qing, without any pretenses. In the second part of the book, sincerity and authenticity are relevant in the discussion of genres with a performative dimension, pointing to an understanding of sincerity as enactment. In terms of speech act theory, these would be genres whose elocution could be described as directive, commissive, or expressive. Prayers and covenants, discussed in chapter 10, usually include commissive speech acts, in which speakers commit to a certain course of action as in a promise. To counterbalance any floweriness of the language, Liu Xie emphasizes that for a prayer to be efficacious, one needs to establish sincerity and have a clear conscience. Liu's awareness of the precariousness of all promises could be why he keeps repeating the curious phrase li cheng when he discusses covenants, and then even later in the encomium. With prayers and covenants, words are clearly only part of the communicative process. It also needs a certain state of mind. Liu Xie also insists on sincerity in chapter 13 on laments and condolences, texts that can be understood as expressive speech acts. Fitting the parallel style, Liu contrasts the proper way of writing a lament, starting from a subdued heart with the wrong way, that is, to subordinate the heart to the text one wishes to produce. Liu cites tears as proof of success, assuming that tears are an involuntary physical response to a certain state of mind. Later in the chapter, he mentions the size of a reader, reaffirming the importance of a physical response, mirroring the writer's state of mind, which is, after all, also understood in physical or corporeal terms. Official communications are genres whose illocutionary force can be described as directive, making requests or giving advice. Again, Liu emphasizes sincerity as a precondition of their efficacy, as here in the example from chapter 23, where we even see two sincerity words in a row. Chapter 27 develops an idea that we know from Cao Pi's Lunwen. And now we are moving to the third part of Wenxin Jiaolong, where sincerity and authenticity especially appear in those chapters that are dedicated to the relationship between the writer's inborn nature, qing, or actual inner condition, qing, on the one hand, and style, ti, or ornamentation or coloration, cai, on the other hand. As already described by Cao Pi's Lunwen, one's writing is necessarily shaped by one's nature. Liu here elaborates on that idea. And although this might suggest a certain determinism, Liu introduces the notion of learning as a corrective here. This also means that one's writing, spontaneous as it might be, will not necessarily be authentic to oneself. Where chapter 27 is rather implicit when it comes to our topic, chapter 31 is more direct. It also returns to an idea that was first expressed in the chapter on laments. The writer needs to start from their actual inner condition rather than from a wish to write or otherworldly concerns. For Liu here, sincerity is not an intrinsic value, but a necessary condition for the creation of certain types of literature. He seems less concerned with the correct outward public manifestation of all inner states than with achieving certain literary results. At the same time, he clearly expresses anxiety concerning the troubling potential of literature and actually all communication to deceive and thus to erode personal and public trusts. I have many questions about all this, and I have now even more than when I started preparing this talk, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very stimulating, particularly pleased by the use of Chinese terminology that really helps me understand what you're doing. Let's move now to Professor Chen, who's slightly closer to us, I think, than Professor Richter was. So please take it away.
Thank you, Professor Charge. Well, I also like to begin by thanking Dr. Miao Xiaojing for organizing this roundtable and for inviting me to participate in this really exciting discussion. There are so many fascinating questions, complicated questions too. So, you know, we all know the saying, there are no bad questions, right? And I think that may be true in the large scheme of things, but there are questions that could open up a whole new world. And there are questions that by themselves do not lead us anywhere secure or certain. And yet, if instead of trying to answer it directly, we turn it on its head, it might reveal a lot more interesting things. So I think one great example of this latter type of question is the author sincere? Or in other words, does the author mean what he or she says? So the simple answer to this is, I think, we can never know, period. End of discussion. But one can also start from this question and ask, does it matter? Does it? And if it does, why does this matter? It does matter, I would say, in the Chinese tradition, and in fact, it matters in other traditions as well, to different degrees at different times. And the importance of this question also has different manifestations in different genres. So in reading classical Chinese Shi poetry, we assume that the poet is always talking about themselves. There is no separation between the speaker and the poet. So this doesn't mean that self-representation does not use rhetorical devices, figuration, and patternings, 修辞, right? But one accepts a basic assumption of authenticity. So, for example, the Tang writer Han Yu was exiled to Chaozhou after he, his notorious, memorial about the Buddha's bones when he advised the emperor against supporting Buddhism. So on the trip, he wrote a poem about his conversation with a clerk at the Changle Rapids. Now, he may have embellished or exaggerated the clerk's speech, but we do not doubt that the poem we read is Han Yu, the historical person, talking about his actual experience rather than making everything up. So this basic assumption of authenticity is an implicit contract that author and reader enter together, the ground on which interpretation happens. So this is very much like the explicit division between fiction and nonfiction in a bookstore, right? When we pick up a book from the nonfiction shelf, we trust that what we're about to read has really happened. And of course, if we learn otherwise, then it becomes a scandal. And there have been many such scandals, actually, even in recent decades. So this assumption about the authenticity of classical Chinese poetry, in the sense that it is something corresponding to facts, that it is referential to external reality, that it is indexical, is a very important assumption. Perhaps because of this basic assumption, we are very easily led to the question of sincerity. But the question of authenticity and the question of sincerity are two separate questions, related but different. And also, for any rule, there are always exceptions. And so I do want to say that classical Chinese Shi poetry is not necessarily always indexical. So I will use Han Yu and Li Shangyin, two Tang writers, to illustrate my points. So just now, I mentioned this Han Yu's poem, The Clerk at the Rapids. So this poem is really a wonderful demonstration of the complexities of the concept of sincerity. So in the poem, he's mocked relentlessly by a lowly clerk who castigates him for being so melancholy about being exiled to Chaozhou. And at the end, the poet, right here, it's a very long poem, it's 72 lines. I just decided not to try to tax you with the whole thing, and there's no time for going into it anyway. But at the end of this long poem, the poet acknowledges that, the clerk is right. And now he realizes he is really lucky that he's only being exiled, not executed, which, by the way, would have happened to Han Yu indeed, but for his friend's intervention. So he was truly, indeed, lucky, right? But is he sincere when he says all this? Or is he being sarcastic, ironic, in order to express more effectively his anger, his frustration, and his sense of injustice about all this that's happening to him? And if so, one could say that the poet is insincere but truthful. That is, if he's being ironic and sarcastic in saying all this at the end of the poem. So many Chinese critics take the poem as insincere. And it doesn't seem to bother anyone that Han Yu hailed as a precursor to the Daoxue way of thinking that very much values Chen, sincerity above all things, says something very insincere, 不诚, right? And some critics and scholars would actually support this reading of insincerity, 不诚, with a context, which is another text. Again, I'm not going to go into that text, but that is a poem, another poem that Han Yu wrote on the same exile trip. And in that poem, he says, I wanted to get rid of corrupted affairs for the sagely and the wise lord, for the emperor. How could I, with this declining, decrepit body of mine, begrudge my remaining years? In other words, he's saying that, I was trying to do a good thing for the state, for the emperor, So reading this poem, Rapid's Clerk, in the context of this poem, that I just mentioned, scholars argue that the poet clearly felt no regret at all for what he did. But the fallacy of this kind of reading, that is, citing other writings by the same author to support one's interpretation of the text at hand, is that the author is perceived as a static entity with no variations in mood, thought, emotions, and beliefs. So the assumption is that, if someone feels about something in a certain way on Monday, he would still feel the same about the same thing on Friday or the next Monday or the Monday 30 years later. So it's also interesting how the seeking of context in other texts kind of ignore the text at hand. It seems to suggest that the text under discussion is in itself not adequate to fully expressing its meaning, and that we must look beyond the text to find the key to its interpretation. I don't think this is necessarily true. And also, what one uses to contextualize the text in question is another text is even more problematic. So I'm not saying that I believe the poet Han Yu is being all sincere and transparent. And actually, I'm not advocating one reading over another, for either reading would require a very profound faith in Han Yu being a simple man, which Han Yu is not. Han Yu is a master of ambiguities, especially in poetry. Rather, I want to use this poem to talk about the complexities of sincerity and about the relationship between authenticity, sincerity, and truthfulness, and also to drive home what I said earlier. If we single-mindedly pursue the question, is the poet being sincere, it doesn't really lead us to any certainty one way or the other, and it wouldn't help us with this poem either. So I think it might be better to ask the question, what is the poet doing with this poem? The clerk may represent a voice from the outside, but when the poet writes him into a poem, the clerk becomes a double voice, because his mockery of the poet becomes the poet's self-mockery. And also, a text is not only a linguistic construct, it is also a unique act every single time it interacts with a reader. At other times, a poet can be utterly sincere, but not necessarily factual. And then here we have Li Shangyin, who wrote many passionate love poems. Nobody knows anything for sure about the poet's alleged love affairs. Li Shangyin himself once said, this is the quote here, although I've written about those lovely ladies, I have never really become romantically involved with any of them. So this is the clearest statement he made about the non-referential nature of his poems. I don't have time to go into this, but let me simply say that Li Shangyin's passion is a fictional passion. He could be every bit passionate in his imagination without being in love with anyone in real life. So it's what I would call a fictionality of feelings. And such a poem may not correspond to fact, but it resonates of truth. So I'll just stop here. I very much look forward to jumping into discussions. Let me just get
Thank you very much. I think we move on to phase two, which is the conversation. I mean, that was the opening, sort of the opening salvos from three distinguished scholars. Do they have anything now to say to each other? I don't know who would like to go first. So,
Okay, can I say something?
yes, please.
I really enjoy Chris's presentation, Antje's presentation, and I have lots of questions about each. But I would just confine myself to saying to Chris that there are a number of really interesting articles and books about cases of forgery. When I work on this topic, when I was thinking about this topic, I feel like all the issues we discuss, authenticity, sincerity, always stem from the basis of there is a lot of inauthentic and insincere, so this is really kind of a secondary, it's because the 不诚 and the 不真 or 不信, they're really the basis on which we base all our discussion. Otherwise, we don't need to have the discussion. But I'm also wondering, maybe this is a really, I don't know if I dare to raise this issue, but, when I see authenticity, right, I kind of think it's really interesting that there are books and articles about all the literary forgeries cases, in the, for example, English literature tradition, or the recent years, the memoir, I'm so glad Antje brought this up, all the fake news and all the misinformation things, people are so obsessed with this, but also make me think of, again, the sort of different kind of forgery cases, that is, the writing of memoir, and then turn out that the memoir is really all made up, and people get really upset, even lawsuits and so on, some really famous cases. And I wonder, how, you would, do you think about this, and how, what are the thoughts about this on the, all the recently emerged manuscripts, bamboo strips, and there are people questioning all this, I find it a very bothersome kind of a question, yeah. And for Antje, I just really kind of interested in Li Cheng establish sincerity, but also another quote from Wen Xindiao Lo I always kind of find very interesting is the 为文而造情, the creating feelings for the sake of Wen. I don't know if you might want to say something about that, or just, yeah.
Right, so maybe, yeah, whoever wants to respond first.
So I find it so interesting that you bring up this question of the fake memoirs. I've also looked into this several years ago, and I've often felt that since you spoke of these different shelves, the fiction shelf and the non-fiction shelf, I often felt that in writing, for example, memoir autobiography, one of the great draws of the genre is that we cannot be sure. That there is this underlying kind of inability to trust fully the author's voice. Much of the fascination comes out of this insecurity that we feel. Yeah, and thinking about Li Cheng and the necessary conditions for writing, and actually connecting to your last words in your presentation, there's of course this famous quotation by Oscar Wilde, who says that all bad poetry stems from true feeling or something like that, from genuine feeling. So genuine feeling not being at all necessary, might be a necessary, but not even a necessary condition to create poetry. And I think this aspect is really discussed in Wen Xindiao in great detail. So that it takes more than feeling, but the absence of feeling as performed feeling, as enacted feeling. And I think this is where the public nature of literature at the time comes into view. Is an area that I felt I I should think more about.
Can I inject in just one quick thing, and just right here is that, you know, so yeah, I agree. I think this is like one of those kind of aphorisms that almost universally accepted, right? Nobody would ever say that, you know, this is, if it stems from fake feelings or inauthentic feelings, you know, and it would be a wonderful thing. So I don't, you know, it's like a 是言志. Nobody would ever say, oh, 是不言志, right? It has to, everybody agrees with this. But the real question, I think, the rub is that, how do we know? How can we tell, right? So that's the, you know, so I think we can all agree that it's really important to have genuine feelings. But when we have, you know, artifact, when we have a text, how do we know that this text stems from real feelings or fake feelings, and the qing that's you know, that's already there, or is just something, the kind of qing that's being made for this, and if the qing is being made for it, can we say it's not true in a way? I mean, I feel that when I read Li Shangyin is very sincere. I believe in the kind of, it's a very believable sincerity. You can say it's very, and I think we all can experience that if when we imagine or daydream, and the kind of feelings is not corresponded to anything in real life, but you can still have very sincere feelings. So yeah.
If I could actually interject then. What interests me in both the comment you just made, Professor Richter, and then also your last lines from your presentation, Professor Tian, was this notion of public performance and how each reading of poetry is sort of unique, right? It's unique to the reader as well. And so when you ask about what is the check, how do we know if it's sincere, if there's authentic feeling? Well, I guess one check then is if you actually feel something as the person experiencing the poem. There's sort of this collapse, as you mentioned, between author and audience, right? That's happening in this communion that's happening. And that, you know, got me sort of, my concern in this whole question then is, you know, how does this relate to manuscript culture? And really, you know, how does text function on the ground in these pre-modern periods?
Right.
And so a question that I would ask to you then, and something that I've been struggling with is, you know, if we look at how these manuscripts that we're turning up, and we see that there's a lot of variation that's going on. There's a lot of willingness to play with texts and their content, right, and their wording. And so even if there is an assumption of an author, right, even once the author function exists into the tongue, you still see with the manuscript culture that, you know, you can change the wording of the text as a reader, as a transmitter. And so what I wonder then is, where does literary self-representation actually sort of occur in the text? Is it at the level of the ornamentation of the words? Because that was something that I saw with the example that I gave with like Wang Chong, right, in the Lunhang. He's saying, you know, you can't fit this sort of this model. It's every poet has their own style. But then if we can manipulate the style, where is the self in all this, right? And so I'd be eager to get your thoughts on that.
I was so interested in seeing Wang Chong use the word to carve in a negative sense. So this is what the craftsmen do. They carve, but it's not the actual work of the literary critic. And the fascinating thing is that by Liu Xie's time in Wenqian Jiaolong, this has been changed. Yeah. Liu Xie rehabilitates carving to a level, or to a very important level. Yeah. So what you see from the outside, so the work of the craftsman and the work of the, let's say, non-craft, artistic, literary person, they are collapsed somehow. So you see this throughout Wenqian Jiaolong, that metaphors, for example, that describe crafts and metaphors that describe I don't know how to call this, like purely intellectual work, are the same. Yeah. So there's no essential difference in that anymore. And I feel that the public place, the public context in which these literary activities, literary practices take take place is an important part of this. And Wang Tung didn't have a public in that sense. Yeah, so maybe some of the issues that he expresses there come from his particular struggle with creating a public for himself.
For sure. And that's why I kind of call myself when I say, it's not an expectation that authors as individuals can be known. It's a desire, right? And it's a desire that's felt by usually individuals who don't have an audience or a public. But it does seem that, especially in these manuscript cultures, there's sort of two levels of interaction with texts that are taking place. There's sort of this author function and this desire to be known through text as the author. But then there's also this more fluid, amorphous sort of interaction. Stephen Owen talks about one poetry, right? There's that one poetry that's out there. And how those two levels start to interact with one another, I think, is a really fascinating topic as well.
Yeah, and also one quick comment about the first slide that Chris, you were showing from the Guo Dian Xingziming Chu manuscript. I saw that it seems to be, the citation there seems to be implying that you can infer a kind of authenticity or kind of from the audience response. I think that's a rather interesting yardstick that one holds for measuring if a text is Chen or not. That if the audience has the right response, then it seems to be implying that then what what they're responding to is Chen. I thought that was a kind of interesting, especially in light of what you said about the text being the mediating force between the author, maybe with quotation marks, and the audience.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess what I was struggling with too is that it seems to me not so much that it's an argument, but it's a presumption, right? And really, for authenticity and sincerity to become conceptualized, there has to be these different intellectual distancing that's happening between language and meaning, between author and audience. But right in that moment in the Warring States period, because of the manuscript culture and how it works, all of that is really collapsed in on itself. It's almost nonsensical to talk about insincerity because you are the one performing the song and you feel that way, right?
I also feel that the criterion that a text almost creates an automatic response in the audience kind of circumscribes the audience. Because if you don't have this kind of response, you don't belong. You've not been educated in our circles. You have not been trained in feeling the right kinds of feelings when you hear a certain shi, etc. So there is also this element of almost exclusionary activity at work in this. As much as we want to locate our response in corporeal, like in tears and sighs, and I start dancing, but not everybody starts dancing to the same kind of music or sighs at the same place. So there's again this interaction between audience and text is there. Yeah, it's a continuum too. I think this is also still there in Wenqin Diaolong. Yeah.
Well, and it's why text, in song in the early period, right, is dangerous and important and potent. And not everyone should create, right? It's the sages who are the ones who were able to sort of manage their emotional responses in a way that's appropriate, encapsulate that in these ritualized pieces that we then perform. And in performing them, we become that emotional state, right? We learn, there's, the education takes place, the moral education takes place, which is why artifice becomes such a big issue here. But your comment also made me start thinking about the sort of the child crawling to the well, right? And Mencius, and sort of, you aren't human if you don't have this sort of natural feeling towards this event. But I think that all starts to plug into ritual and ritual education, which we can hear about more from you as well.
Yeah, I suppose to me too, I'm very pleased to see all three of you engaging with the Chinese terminology. and exploring that in different ways. I mean, that came through in all three. And that's always, I think, very important, because when we start talking about authenticity, sincerity, we very much are thinking in our own terms. So it is very important to make a map, a sort of taxonomy of the terminology in the Chinese. And I saw also all three of you were starting to address the antonyms, the insincere, what sorts of words are there? And I'm keen to explore, I mean, whether we can do that here or not, but it'd be very interesting to think about the range of terminology that is opposite that. For example, what is the difference between artifice and forgery, for example? I mean, there are all sorts of things we can do with Wei. The fact that the word Qing has as one of its antonyms, Qing Wei, is sort of the true and false, or I mean, that, as far as I know, it's fairly early, that particular antonym compound. So it seems that there are a lot of possibilities there. And of course, also, we got onto fiction and fictionality and that kind of stuff. And how does that fit into it? You know, the fact that people study sort of Xiaofei and they talk about the Six Dynasties, Zhiguai and the Chuanqi, all those sorts of stuff. But did people really think of that as being fiction when they wrote it? It seems to be more, it has to be presented as something true. That I heard this from so-and-so, the Yi Jianzhi, for example. There's always a very specific time and a place and a name of a place and a name of a person. It has that, it's, you know, like Glenn Durbridge argued, it's almost a kind of history. It isn't fiction. So there are all kinds of things here that are different. Also, it's fascinating that Antje was talking about the extraordinary change from Han to Wenxin Diaolong, and yet Han Yu, in a way, is almost a deliberate sort of rejection of all that stuff. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about Han Yu, but he's sort of all this artifice, all of this crafting is getting in the way of the message, you know, what really matters. But, so other comments or observations from any of our speakers?
I was, thanks to Robert for these very inspiring comments. I was thinking, right, and for sincerity and authenticity, we actually are kind of lucky to have rather nicely corresponding, you know, Chinese terms. That is, the Chinese terms themselves are actually, in a way, you know, you don't need to kind of do, you know, elastic kind of stretching, and they really fit very much into, you know, the meanings of these terms. You know, one is Zhen and one is Cheng. You know, they can be related. They're definitely related, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And so I find that very interesting. And the artifice, I was just a kind of a small, you know, kind of a comment also, you know, to responding to what Antje was earlier was, you know, saying about Wenxin Diaolong, the first chapter, is that, you know, and also about his energy that Liu Xi invested into this term, Diao, the carving, all that. You know, it's just interesting that he's so strenuous. It just seems like he made a strenuous efforts to try to almost like try to convince his readers, and that, you know, so the artifice is actually part of nature. You know? So, like the opening, right? You know, so the fur, the pattern, this is all part of nature. But sometimes I feel like he talks himself into, you know, because he's trying so hard to argue that the artifice is actually also part of what is naturally so, you know, like 自然. And so try to efface that, you know, that is, so the patterning on the tiger and the leopard, you know, all that. So it looks like a patterning. It looks like, you know, beautifying, you know, surface, but that is also part of nature. And so is Wen. Yeah.
I often feel he almost imitates, well, probably not intentionally, like discursive situations where we ourselves sometimes run into these dead ends, and then we have to take a turn and move back and take back some of the things that we phrased into excessive terms earlier. And so I don't see him actually as a participant in much discursive action. At least we don't have historical records about that. But the text seems to suggest that. So we could again ask the big sincerity question. But where would it help? Is I ask myself. I wouldn't want to ask it, yeah, but I know what you mean.
I sort of wonder about the word Chen. I mean, it's sort of truthfulness, the way we would understand it, is definitely a major part of that word. But I think also of all the early examples, the word Chen is something very positive and powerful. It's potent. It actually exerts, you have the Jing Chuan Suo Zhi, Ji Zhi Wei Kai, that kind of thing. But there are many other stories like that where someone's Chen or Jing Chen, that concentrated Chen, can actually affect material objects or affect other people's thinking, that somehow it's something that our word sincerity wouldn't include. I don't know how far forward in time that kind of story, I mean, we have the saying still exists, but whether that kind of idea continued Han and later, I don't know.
Yeah, Trilling remarks at one point that sincerely has become more like an intensifier. And I think the same actually happened to Chen in a way, and similar such words, that they are used in that way. I actually found this Thesaurus, TSL, Thesaurus Lingua Sinica, quite interesting, where I looked at Christoph Habsmeyer's project. I don't know actually who's doing this nowadays. I looked at the it's a fascinating, I mean, it's still in its early days, but it's a fascinating map of a semantic map that we are seeing there. So I think many of these potent words become less potent in certain contexts when they are used attributively. Oh, it's truly so, etc. So there's both are still there, both potencies.
What I find interesting about Chen is that it's a difference from Xin when you put these terms side by side. If you only focus on one term, it kind of sometimes without the contrast and comparison doesn't yield a full scale of meaning. But when you put Chen side by side with Xin, then I feel that Xin definitely involves a third party or the audience, is almost to be convincing, to be trustworthy. It involves another person, but the Chen can be squarely just focused in one single person. You can be Chen, and it doesn't matter how other people respond to you. But the Xin is very, kind of different. That's why I just thought the first Guodian citation was rather interesting. It mentions Xin, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the English word forgery is a very interesting word, because forge is actually is a good word. It doesn't mean anything as to make. It's a rather neutral word. But when it becomes, used as gradually becomes a forgery, I don't know when, I think maybe 19th century, they began to use forgery to talk about, to falsify, to make something, and then it, but to forge something is just to make something, to create. So it seems like an inherent.
The same is true for fake.
Yeah, fake is also the etymology is also very interesting. But it doesn't. I mean, but to forge is really, you can forge a path. You can forge, kind of to create, to wrought something. Yeah, it's basically 做.
I was just going to say, you can almost make the same case for zuo, right? Like it's a potent act that actually is a positive thing that's reserved for the sages. But precisely because of this, it comes to have this negative connotation if you, by doing it, you then presume that you are something you are not, right? So, yeah, it's a very interesting observation.
Okay, I've received a signal that it's probably time to move on to phase 3 of this of these proceedings, which I guess means that the recording goes off.